One of our politicians sort of glibly said, we're still a major military power. I mean, our politicians are kidding themselves. We should have an army that is capable of fighting at high intensity, and then it's very easily to move down from that to deal with lower intensity. You know, people don't fight for their country. I mean, and we're talking about people here on the front line in that close battle who are having to fight, you know, face to face with the enemy. They don't fight for their country in those contexts. They fight for their mates. But we don't educate our MPs about defence and security. They come into it from all their different backgrounds and perspectives. Most of them have got no experience of defence at all, and they don't have an instinctive understanding of what we're talking about here. And when it comes to the world as a whole, if I'm brutally honest, I think many of them are incredibly naive.
Very warm welcome, Major General Tim Cross, CBE, veteran Army fellow, 3 tours in the Balkans amongst many other operational tours. I think our era of people did a lot of time on operations. Military logistics expert. You joined the British Army back in 1971, but you commanded at every level in a really distinguished career in the Army. So very warm welcome.
Thank you.
To this latest episode of In Defence, where we're looking at the Army, British Army, and in the context of defence review, what might happen, what does the future hold? So can I kick this off by going, the UK has been focused on expeditionary warfare for the last 35 years or so, you know, wars of choice rather than wars of national survival. But what do you think of the implications now of a more dangerous world, a potential for more wars of national survival? What does that impact for the British Army? What does this nation need from its army for the next few years and the decades rolling forward?
I mean, it has been a significant change. There's no doubt about that. And the bottom line is, I think that you know, we in the West need to understand that it hasn't gone well. You know, we've failed in many respects. The Taliban are back in power in Afghanistan. Some of these wars we got engaged with for understandable, you know, almost moral reasons, under the umbrella of responsibility to protect, and a feeling that somehow, having won the Cold War, we now had the right and indeed the duty to go around these other places trying to bring about change and so on. That has not worked well. And a world that may have thought, the global South and other countries may have thought the West knew best, and that they stood up for the rule of law, etc., etc. I think that's genuinely changed.
I don't think the British Army failed. I think the political landscape failed. A lack of clarity over what the objective was. For example, the shift in objective in Afghanistan was largely to blame. I think, having served out there, both of us have spent time. You know, I think there was a hugely professional military involvement in Afghanistan, but collectively as a nation, the lack of clear political resolve left us somewhat exposed, and therefore the withdrawal from there has left almost a stain on our reputation, which I'm not sure is justified militarily, but I do think politically there are some lessons to draw from that.
Well, I'd agree to that to a degree, but I think there is something about the military piece. I think there's a defining time around 2006 where we were still engaged in Iraq, and the government made this decision to go into Afghanistan. So, of course, it was a political choice, but we did not have the combat power, the size and shape needed to be able to engage in both of those operations and really make a difference. And the reality was that we were unable to succeed in either of those theatres of operation because the army, leave aside anything else, the army wasn't big enough to be able to sustain those sort of capabilities, you know, over a long period of time. So there was something about trying to do things without the size and shape required in the defence world to do it, and the army was very much a part of that. So I think we're moving out of that era of being prepared to engage in these expeditionary operations in the way that we saw them, the wars of choice. The world is always dangerous, but it is more complex. The rise of China is definitely, you know, a much bigger issue than it was even, you know, 20 years ago. Russia and Ukraine we can come back to, but clearly Russia is pushing hard to try and re-establish itself as a world power, and, you know, for all sorts of reasons, again, we can come back to. And then there are all sorts of other issues in the Middle East and North Korea and Iran and so forth that have made life much more complicated. From an army point of view, I therefore don't see us deploying the size and shape that we deployed back in 1990, the first Gulf War, and subsequently so forth, you know, 30-odd thousand people to engage in land operations. I don't think we'll be doing that, you know, for quite a long time. So in the context of the defence review, the issue is, what is this change that's going on? What was the world going to look like? and how do we engage with that from a defence-wide capability, and where does the army fit into it? I think there's two issues. One is the internal home base, and then there's the external picture. And the home base, which throughout my career, throughout our career, has always been considered to be secure, less a strategic nuclear exchange, which are clearly pretty significant. But, relatively speaking, the home base has always been secure. I think that's changing. I think it's changed already, and it will continue to change. The grey zone, the cyber, the undersea cables, the whole of the way that internally the size and shape of our population and what's going on, internal divisions and so on. So we need to look at the home base and decide what's needed there from a defence and security point of view. And then we need to look at the external threat and what our role in the world will be. This cry of global Britain, what does that actually mean in the context of this?
But it's also an interesting question of scale, isn't there? You use the example of Russia, and of course there will be some countries like Poland that will probably feel the heat more, and therefore, if you're looking at NATO, which is largely our security umbrella, where would the troops come from potentially to address that? But it's interesting the scale. How many Russian forces are deployed into Ukraine at the moment? It's very hard to get an actual number, but a number of about 700,000 is a figure that I've heard bandied around quite a lot, out of an army, including reserves and everything, of well over 1 million. If you look at the British Army today, what size is it today?
Yeah.
And when the most recent exercise, I think I've noted down here, what was the steadfast dart?
Yeah.
There was a big fanfare in the newspapers because we deployed this huge force. When I looked at the numbers, we were actually deploying 2,600 military personnel. And they called it one div, but last I heard, a division is normally at 10 to 25,000 people. So this is 10% of the size. Now, admittedly, it depends on what you're trying to achieve. There's command and control. But you know better than I, logistically supporting 25,000 is a very different task than 2,600. Is that something that's even remotely achievable for our nation today?
I mean, the short answer is no. Yes, the Russians have got huge numbers in that fight in Ukraine. And, of course, the Ukrainians have had to produce large numbers and they've been able to stand against it. They've tried to mobilise and the initial intent was to mobilise 1 million men. That's what Zelensky was talking about a couple of years ago. They haven't been able to achieve that. The Russians, as we know, don't care about casualties, and what Ukraine is showing is that mass still matters, numbers still matter, and if you're up against an enemy like Russia who doesn't care about casualties, then you're going to be in trouble if you haven't got the equivalent combat power, fighting power to go against that. I think, looking at Europe, Poland, Finland, other nations, the Baltic states are clearly hard up against that threat. We aren't. So I don't see that we're going to try to put in the sort of numbers that we're talking about in the context of what's going on in Ukraine. I do think that mass still matters, and I do think from a UK point of view, the ability to put into play a divisional sized organisation still matters. And one of the key things that I think is going to come out of this SDI is that the case, and what does that division look like? It doesn't mean to say necessarily the numbers are the same, but the technology, the capabilities, the fighting power, the ability to destroy the enemy with long-range weapons and deep fires and all these other things we're going to be looking at. The lethality of that force has to be the equivalent.
And I guess that's what part of my question around this really is, that when we talk about the British Army, the public debate tends to be around numbers.
Yeah.
That's, it's always about the size and today you can put the whole of the British Army in Twickenham and there'll be a lot of seats empty, which is, you sort of go, hang on a minute, that looks relatively small. But again, my amateur historian bit says World War I, World War II, millions of people died. There has been a sense that the British military has looked at how can we use technology to avoid having these dreadful attritional battles. And is there a way, or now where we've fallen foul, I think, in Ukraine, is we just don't have the stockpiles. And when those run out, you're back into an attritional battle. So I guess my question is the future army categorised by numbers and size, or is there a different metric we should be looking at in terms of its lethality and its fighting capability?
Well, it all comes down to fighting power and what the capabilities are that enable you to deliver fighting power on the battlefield. I mean, picking up your earlier point, I remember years ago with General Rupert Smith looking at what were the formations in play in World War One, World War Two, and where we were today. And we used to talk about army groups and armies and corps and divisions and so on. They were largely numbers of men with relatively small technology to support them, armoured fighting vehicles, artillery and so on, but in the context of today's technology. So when we look at a modern brigade, there's a clear argument that brigade's fighting power is the equivalent of an old, at least division, probably a corps, in terms of the numbers. So we don't need to reinvent those numbers. But going back to your earlier point again, I remember having a conversation about, we used to talk about small, very small, medium and large scale deployments. A large scale deployment of a division is 25,000, roughly. So when people talk about a large scale deployment, which they were in the context of that exercise, and talk about 2,500 people, frankly, they're kidding themselves. You do not deliver the sort of lethality and the combat power with those sorts of numbers. Numbers still matter, but we're not talking about having to generate tens of thousands or doubling the size of the army in the context of the conversation of the SDR and so on. So we do have to use technology. We do have to bring to bear technology to enable that force to deliver that fighting power, but in a different way. And there's no doubt, there's a lot of conversation about that. Current Chief of the General Staff, Chief of Defence Staff, lots of people are talking about what does that mean? What does it look like? The ability to engage in the deep battle, so you're not having to engage in a close battle where you take lots of casualties. What does that look like? Clearly, it has to be done in conjunction with air power and in conjunction with allies. But for us, I think this is a significant moment of change. We're no longer talking about, I don't think from an army point of view, deploying tens of thousands of people to fight in a land campaign.
So things like, was it Boris Johnson who famously talked about, it was the end of the tank, we're not going to see tanks rolling across the European plains anytime soon. But I do think, you look at Ukraine and others, what's the future for the role of a tank, and what does that size and scale look like? Is it back to bigger, better, heavier, or is there room for smaller, lighter, more agile, greater quantity? And likewise, we've seen in Ukraine, the drone technology, the pace of that. What do you think are the lessons? Because the danger is we don't want to be prepared to fight the Ukraine war, but what do you think lessons that flow from that might inform this very discussion?
Well, the lessons that we're learning from Ukraine are engaged. A lot of people are engaged in. Okay, so what is this telling us? When we deliver fighting power, we're talking about an all-arms capability, and what that means is you've got, using the traditional terminology, you've got the combat arms, the combat support arms, and the combat service support arms. You've got the armour, the infantry, the artillery. You've got the engineers, you've got the signals, communications capability. You've got all of the support structures, the logistics, the medical, the engineering and so forth that supports that. And if you're going to deliver a sustainable capability to engage in high-intensity warfighting, you have to see that totality of all of that. So therefore, it's not just about... if you go back to Blitzkrieg and so forth, that was a lot of armour going long distances relatively easily without an awful lot of other support other than air Stukas and so forth. That's we're no longer in that place. So I don't think we want to have the sorts of numbers of tank regiments that we had during the Cold War, and we had a lot of them. We're now down to, though, having said that, a couple of regiments, and one has to argue whether that's gone too far. But those, what we'd be using those regiments for in delivering the fighting power we're talking about in the context of the potential theatres of operation we're going to be operating in. And going back to my earlier point, I think what we're trying to balance is that sort of traditional fighting power with the new technologies of cyber, space, and the ability to deliver deep attack, long-range attack, that means you don't have to fight those close battles. So in one sense, there's nothing new in any of this. It's about balancing the various capabilities you have in order to deliver what it is you're trying to deliver. What does that look like in today's world? There's no doubt that technology is changing that equation.
Yeah, but one pushback I'd give a bit, I think, is that you and I have both been involved in a lot of operations, and a lot of the media and everything focuses on the tip of the sword.
Yeah, sure.
But without the logistics support and everything else that goes with it, and I don't want to get boring and talk about logistics.
Oh, please do.
No, exactly. I know it's your forte. But actually, without logistics, the whole thing crumbles. And more importantly, the last 35 years, it's all been about efficiency. It's been just in time.
Sure.
It's not. Whereas when you and I were serving, if you did that, your enemy would have a really easy artery to sever.
Yeah.
And therefore you had to have redundancy, you had to have stockpiles, you had to... What the war in Ukraine has exposed. So actually, fundamentally, it feels like there's a very different shift in the paradigm of how we launch our military. We have to invest a lot in some of that redundancy. And that particular is your area of expertise.
Yeah, it is. And the Cold War years when we had, large stockpiles of equipment and capability and so forth, as a result of the changes over those 30 years we were talking about earlier, we didn't expect to engage in high-intensity warfighting in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. That's not what we thought we were going to be involved with, and we certainly didn't use the sort of size and scale of logistics that's been burnt up in Ukraine on a daily basis. And we have hollowed out our logistic capabilities, no doubt about that, over the last 20 or 30 years. The old maxim that amateurs discuss tactics, professionals discuss logistics, like most truisms, is true because it's true. And it is true. And therefore, if we're going to be, if we're serious about, engaging in the sort of things we're talking about, we do have to build that logistic resilience, sustainability. Nobody thought the Ukraine was going to last for the length of time it has. It has burnt up huge quantities, artillery ammunition, as well as all sorts of other stuff. So I'm not saying that we should be preparing to fight a 3-year land battle somewhere, but if you're serious about having a land capability that's going to deliver effect and be able to make a difference, you've got to be able to sustain. It's not just the numbers of infantry and armoured and so forth. You've got to deploy that capability and you've got to sustain it over time. And that requires all those things we were talking about, the combat support, the combat service support, and so on.
If it looks, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if we are maybe less likely to deploy large land footprints to a European response to Russia, for example, what's the domestic agenda, do you think, for the British Army? What role do you think that has in defence of our island nation?
Well, it's interesting that the defence review is not a defence and security review, because security, of course, encompasses all sorts of other things. I mean, I think there's a number of issues here. One is that with climate change and all that's going on internally, as a result, droughts and floods and more extreme weather conditions and so forth, the army traditionally has provided support to the civil authorities to deal with some of those sorts of things, alongside fireman strikes, fuel strikes, train strikes, and all sorts of other things. And the army has always been, in a way, reluctant to do that because it tends to divert the attention from what its main purpose is.
I think it's been a lot more than reluctant. I mean, you and I have witnessed, I think, some of the conversations that some of the military hierarchy have been absolutely robust. Yeah. That's not our job.
Yeah. But I personally disagree with that. I think we are part of the nation's security resilience, and with climate change, amongst a number of other things, that will continue to be an important part of what we deliver. Now, I'm not saying I hope there's lots more strike. I mean, I remember a period where we were literally dealing with prison strikes, fire strikes, fuel strikes, almost next to it concurrently, and it was a big drain on our capability and our resources. But that's a reality, and our infrastructure today. We don't want to go down some sort of rabbit hole here, but most of our infrastructure that we've got in the nation was designed and built for a population of about 55 million, something like that. We now have a population verging on 70 million for all sorts of reasons, and that infrastructure is creaking in all sorts of ways. So I do think there is a role there for the, in inverted commas, traditional military support to the civil authorities, not from a maybe downstream from a security point of view, as in, rioting and so forth. That may or not appear. We've seen a bit of that in the summer. The police have been capable of dealing with that, but, who knows?
But do you think that would be a forced driver? Do you think that would be...
No, I don't think it would be.
Because in the past, it's largely been, you've got this standing army. It's a bit like you've got a fire brigade. You have to have them for the 0.1% of the time there's a fire. But 99.9% of the time when there isn't a fire, do you use them? And I think there is an element of that conversation that says that if you're going to have a standing army and it's not being used, then how do you most effectively use it? Which is good training as well as command and control.
It is, and it's good. Northern Ireland was a fantastic ground to train leadership in young corporals and so on. The fire strikes and dealing with all of those other things we've been talking about. Yeah, that's why I personally never had a problem with the fact that we were involved in all of that stuff. And as a nation, if you're spending money on defence and there's a need for it in terms of the home base issue, which we're talking about, why wouldn't you want to use it? And I think that reluctance is probably, needs to be pushed to one side in inverted commas. But alongside that is the threat on the home base from these other threats out there, the external threats like the undersea cables issue, which we've seen quite a lot of media about, but also the missile, which there's been a lot of media speculation on that literally in the last week or so, about missile defense and our capability of holding or being able to destroy incoming missiles, long-range incoming missiles, which would be a mixture of land, sea and air. But when you look at air defense from an army point of view, we're pretty thin on the ground. I mean, we've got, I think, one Rapier defence regiment left, and we've virtually got no medium range capability. So missile defence against the home base. And I think there are other issues there we need to think about, which are in many respects, we're consolidating our military in the UK in single locations. We've created these super garrisons. The RAF have consolidated on a single basis. So a missile attack against one of our major RAF bases could take out a heck of a lot of our capability of our air power. And an attack on Lark Hill or Aldershot or Bulford or Catterick or whatever would seriously affect our land fighting.
No, I think one of the reasons that this whole series of the podcast in defence has been started is because if you have a seismic shift in wars of expeditionary warfare now and wars of choice to wars of national survival, there are huge gaps. You've cited the missile defence one. There's lots of big questions that we've got to answer, but some of those, if you're less likely to be deployed overseas and more likely it's more looking after the defence of the nation, the danger is what is the role of the army in that context.
Sure.
And you still need boots on the ground. You still need to be able to take a hold ground, etc. But we've seen over time the size of the army diminish significantly. And yet, despite that, there's still been a recruiting challenge for all the services, not just the British Army. And therefore, there's less of a public awareness of fewer people around who've got experience in the military. Is this, therefore, is conscription one of those things that should be on the table now to increase awareness for the public, to create a larger body of people who have military experience upon which we can draw in times of crisis? Do you think we're close to the time when conscription might be?
I'm not in favour of military conscription in the way that most people envisage it. Actually, if I may, I just want to go back to an earlier point too, which is to stress that part of those changes we've talked about were because over this period post-Cold War, we've moved from an operational imperative to a business imperative. We've driven down efficiency. We've gone down the efficiency route as opposed to the effectiveness route. So the consolidation of a lot of the air capability onto single bases was as a result of looking at it from an efficiency perspective. The reason we've gone into super garrisons is because of efficiency. And I argued long and hard while I was still serving that the balance between a operational imperative and a business imperative is a key balance, and we have got that wrong. We pushed too far down the business imperative. So just-in-time logistics, which you referred to and so forth, may or may not have been, and in my view never has been, the right answer, but it certainly isn't the answer if you're talking about the sort of potential engagements that we may be involved with. Now, in terms of conscription, I'm not in favour of mass conscription in the way that mobilising during World War II or whatever. But we have to recognise the reality that the army effectively, in terms of being able to deploy an army, we're probably not talking about more than about 50,000. The army's strength is supposedly around 72,000. A lot of those are involved in sustaining headquarters and training and all sorts of other stuff. So the numbers you can actually deploy, I think probably is closer to 40,000, maybe even less actually. And our reserves are only about 25,000. Back in the Cold War days, the reserves were 80,000 plus, 85,000. One of the issues, though, is that, going back to one of our earlier conversations, for a lot of young people, they're not convinced that we have the moral high ground in much of this stuff. They've not been impressed with what's been happening over the last 30 years. And there's not that inclination. The military is not as attractive as it used to be. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for that. Because, when I was young, military was a pretty good plan for a career. And there wasn't, there were other things you could do, but it was a major issue for youngsters. Most people had got parents who'd served in the war. The military, knew about the military. Most people understood the military. That's just not the case today. the military is a minority sport in inverted commas. It's, the vast majority of people out there do not have an understanding what the military is about, down to rank structure. I mean, I retired as a major general. Most people refer to me as major. Well, good for keeps me humble, but nonetheless, it does show that they don't have a feel for it. So I think recruiting we are really struggling with recruiting. Now, there's all sorts of reasons behind that. We might come back to it. The regimental system, the messages we've been pushing out over the last few years, in terms of, all sorts of other stuff we can come back to. And retention is very poor at the moment. And when I have to ask the question, why is that the case? I think it's because people are deploying all over the place on all sorts of deployments, which are taking them away from family and home and so on. We've got teams of people of 10 strong doing what 30 people used to do. And I know from my own conversations with a lot of people that they're just finding the pace just too much.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because you and I have talked outside of this before, that when we were involved in Afghanistan, notwithstanding our collective memory of that experience is not positive, the British Army wasn't having any problem recruiting during that time. And it almost feels like when you are involved in wars, there's a slightly odd psyche that says it creates the opportunity for adventure. And yet I know a couple of people's sons who've recently left the British Army because they say, we're not really doing anything at the moment. So there is that interesting context that actually keeping people busy is often a very good attraction.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think the messaging of the British Army in recruiting terms, there's been a lot of change in recruiting. Closure of recruiting offices and going over to an IT-driven system, which, from personal experience has been, I think, a complete failure. Capita, I just don't think have done a good job on this recruiting issue. But yes, there is definitely an issue that if I join, what am I going to be engaged with? And there's something about being able to be involved in the sort of Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth. And the messaging too has been, I think, from the government, as a positive, as a desire to send a message that the army is, I've got to go about language here, but much more diverse, much more soft. Humanitarian operations have been pushed hard. The way we look after our people has been, we're good employers and all this sort of stuff. And I've got to be careful about being overly harsh on that. But frankly, for me anyway, that was not the way to go. I think we want to be presented as a very capable, hard-hitting, war-fighting organisation engaging around the world in doing the right thing. Now, again, as we've said, that argument is much more difficult to sustain after what we've been involved with over the last 30 years.
So you don't think conscription is, because there's lots of critics of conscription, but there are also growing voices that say this might be the answer.
Yeah, there are, and the idea that when you talk to people who served during national service, even now I meet guys who are in their 90s who say my national service was a fantastic time, almost the best time in my life, and there is something about that. So going back to the original question, I think for a generation of youngsters that are coming through, without getting into the social issues and so forth, encouraging them in some shape or form to do some form of national service, working within the NHS or within education or within the social world, of which the military is a part. It's one of the options that you can opt for. I'm not against that at all, but I do think we also need to recognise, and I think it would be the same in those other areas, we don't have an army big enough to look after large numbers of youngsters coming into the military for 6 months or a year or 18 months. It soaks up a lot of manpower looking after these guys. You've got to have the barracks for them. You've got to have the equipment for them to train with. You've got to have the training areas for them to work on and so forth. So there's no quick answer to this. But I do think that the idea of bringing more people into a national service environment is a good one, and the military could play a part in that.
Yeah, because you talk about the sort of, because if you do, there was a talk, wasn't there, a while back about having 20 or 30,000 people a year.
Yeah.
But then when you looked at the number of people that you needed to have in the training system,
exactly,
it was a phenomenal burden. But, and there's a big but, if the priorities are less about deploying on expeditionary warfare, wars of choice, and more about creating a foundation upon which you can exploit if the day ever comes,
That's how you generate your mass from if you need to.
Yeah.
And other countries do that very successfully. Quite a few countries in Europe have the equivalent of national conscription and hold their people, train them, and so forth. So yeah, I mean, it's doable. You come back to what are they prepared to put into this, and are they prepared to make the difficult political choices about national service in the round?
Can we also touch, because this link to the regimental system, and at the risk of opening up I guess part of it is that in simple terms, the regimental system seems to have served our nation and the British Army incredibly well for centuries. But if you are going to have a size of army, as we were talking about, 50, 60, 70,000, it's very difficult for that system to sustain that size of army. Do you think that's a problem for the army going forward, a distraction because of all of the emotion around it, or do you think that's inevitable? Some of the leadership of the army have had a go at addressing some of this, haven't they already? Yeah,
General Mike Jackson, when he was Chief of the General Staff, took some very difficult choices, and it was built around the sort of issues we're talking about. Now, a large chunk of the army is not part of a regimental system in the sense that we understand it. I mean, I was part of a logistic organisation, which is a core. The engineers are a core. The signals are a core. So the regimental system is essentially infantry and armour. You join a particular regiment. And it does carry with it, I think, a really important emotional baggage, if you like. People don't fight for their country. And we're talking about people here on the front line in that close battle who are having to fight face to face with the enemy. They don't fight for their country in those contexts. They fight for their mates. They fight for the fact that this regiment has stood firm in Napoleon's time, in the World War I, in World War II, in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have held the line. And when they look around them and they're steeped in that military history for their regiment, for their battalion, that matters to people in different ways to different people, because we all see these things slightly differently. There's no doubt that when Mike Jackson changed that regimental system and got rid of some of the traditional county regiments, the Devon and Dorsets and others, it had an impact. People really got excited about it. But we've seen with, for example, the Rifles, that they've been able to build an esprit de corps that I think is pretty impressive. I do think that keeping some of the old hat badges would have helped. I think the Scottish Division has suffered terribly in terms of recruiting for losing some of those old regimental titles. But ultimately, it's not just about crusty old generals complaining that we're getting rid of a particular hat badge. It's again about how do we deliver fighting power better, and what does that look like, and recognising that emotional piece forms a part of the moral component of fighting power. It provides part of the basis on which people will hold.
But do you think that's well understood? And that's my point, I think.
No, I don't.
People look at numbers.
Yeah. Outside the military, maybe even outside of the army, people don't understand that in the same way as we do.
No.
Now, I'm not saying you simply defend on those grounds, but you do have to recognise that is an issue. And Mike Jackson did. I mean, Mike Jackson took that very seriously and was very conscious, and was able to hold. I think he held the ground far more than people were fearful of at that time. But that was quite a long time ago now. I mean, we're going back 15, 20 years probably. Well, certainly 20 years.
Yeah, we could talk so much about so much of this stuff. One of my other points I think I'd just like to get your view on is that we started off this whole conversation about Afghanistan and how that's left a bit of it was a bad experience. And I take the point that there was a military element to that. But I do wonder whether our politicians have softened over the years and become less and less robust. Military deterrence is as much about your capability as your ability, your credibility.
Yeah.
And the credibility is not a military decision, it's a political decision. And I think we've seen in Ukraine a lot of vacillation by some countries in NATO and about, because we're worried about... The Defence Review is going to focus only on the military part of our nation's capability, and particularly if we end up folding under NATO. NATO overwhelms by mass any potential enemy. The big weakness, it seems to me, is the political willingness to actually be robust, to be credible, to be resilient. How do we make sure we breed a new generation of politicians that recognise that they are a crucial part of our nation's defence?
Yeah, clearly there's a lot of issues here. I think, first of all, I do think Ukraine has changed the dynamic. There are lots of people, politicians and others in key positions who are saying that Russia, we need to stand firm against Russia. Ukraine has changed the dynamic. The idea that post-Cold War, that no nation state would invade another nation state boundaries has been blown through the water. I mean, Russia has, that's what Russia has done. And therefore, in doing it, if they are successful, it will embolden others to do it. And clearly, one of those concerns for us would be somewhere like China. So there are politicians certainly saying that they recognise that this is a change, that we've got to be more robust about it. To be fair to the politicians, on the one hand, this is about resources. It's about how much can we put into defence. So all the conversations about 2%, 2.5%, 3%, whatever, spend on defence has got to be put in the context of the current economic climate and so forth. But I do think part of the issue is, from a UK perspective, we don't prepare our members of Parliament well to understand defence. I met recently with the MP for my home constituency, which is Aldershot. For the very first time, it's a woman who'd been elected, and I think for the first time in about 100 years, it's a Labour Party member rather than a Conservative. It's been traditionally Conservative, and usually often with an ex-military or somebody who knew the military well. And Alex Baker, I've met with her, and she's great. I mean, she is part of that new generation that's come in as a result of the last election. She's been selected to go on the House of Commons Defence Committee, but how much does she understand about defence? How much is it rooted in her? Is questionable. I mean, she's going to have to learn, and she's quite prepared to do that. But we don't educate our MPs about defence and security. They come into it from all their different backgrounds and perspectives. Most of them have got no experience of defence at all, and they don't have an instinctive understanding of what we're talking about here. And when it comes to the world as a whole, if I'm brutally honest, I think many of them are incredibly naive about what countries like Russia and Iran and North Korea and China can potentially do. And it is all about deterrence. It's all about credibility. It's all about being showing that these nations that they will not succeed in places like Ukraine. And the reality of the last couple of years is, for most of Western Europe, we have been very slow to respond and to give Ukraine the capability, not just of holding ground, but of forcing Russia back out of the territories that they.
And I guess that's my point, is that I do think you can spin this either way. If you're a politician serving, you can say, we stand by Ukraine till the end. If you look at it from the other side, NATO, the West, has got significantly more combat power, orders of magnitude more than Russia has available. If we'd wanted to stop Russia, we could have done, but nuclear saber rattling and all this sort of stuff has meant we were a bit cautious, and that almost certainly that lack of political resolve has had an influence in our level of engagement and Ukraine's prospects. My concern is when you do a defence review, if you only focus on the military part of that and don't also focus on the political part, which feels to me a vital component of building that deterrence. Small d, not talking about nuclear, I'm just talking about the credibility that you not only have got the military capability, but you're prepared to use it.
Yeah, and it's why that defence review, and I said earlier on, I don't know why it's just a defence review, not a strategic security and defence review, but it must start with an understanding of the geopolitical situation in the world, and what do we, as a UK, what do we hold firm to, what are our values, what are we prepared to defend? And for a lot of people, I don't think they understand what we're prepared to defend or why we would defend it. I happen to believe that Western civilization in the round is in trouble here for all sorts of reasons. But you have to start at that level. You have to start with what's happening in the world, and what do we think we want to engage with, and where are we prepared to stand. And to be fair to the previous, over this previous 30 years, and we could talk about individuals, but Blair's Chicago speech was a defining time.
You are the most powerful country in the world, and the richest. You are a great nation. You have so much to give and to teach the world. And I know you would say, in all modesty, a little to learn from it too, occasionally. And it must be difficult and sometimes irritating to find yourselves the recipient of every demand, to be called upon in every crisis, to be expected always and everywhere to do what needs to be done. The cry, "What's it got to do with us?" must be heard fairly regularly on the lips of your people and be the staple of many a politician running for office. Yet just as with the parable of the individuals and the talents, so those nations which have the power have the responsibility to use it wisely. We need you. We need America engaged. We need the dialogue with you. Europe over time will become stronger and stronger, I believe, but its time is some way off yet. And so I say to you, never fall again for the doctrine of isolationism, because the world truly cannot afford it. Stay, please, a country outward-looking, with the vision and the imagination that is the very best of your nature. And realize, too, that in doing so, you will have in Britain a friend and an ally that will stand with you, work with you, fashion with you the design of a future built on peace and prosperity for all, which is the only dream that makes humanity worth preserving.
And I absolutely understand why he said it, and to be honest, I recognised and supported some of what he was saying. We should not stand by and watch as 800,000 are killed in Rwanda, massacred in Rwanda, as people like Saddam Hussein were doing what they were doing, what Milosevic was doing, ethnic cleansing and so on. They were perfectly understandable and laudable intent. But if you're not prepared to put in the capability to deliver on that intent, then it's all... you're not going to fulfil the intent. So the current what is the current political view of the world? What do we think we stand for, and what are we prepared to invest in order to deliver on that? And I sense that there's been a retrenchment, and there will be a great reluctance to engage unless we are really forced to, and that has all sorts of impacts downstream.
So, mindful of the time, one other question for you. It does feel like, as we speak now, Donald Trump's been talking about 5% GDP.
Yeah.
The British government has pledged 2.5%, but it hasn't really got there yet. And there's lots of rumours that actually it'll actually end up being defence cuts rather than investment. And from what we've talked about, it's likely going to affect all three services, but it might affect the British Army even more. If you were king for the day, where do you think your three priorities would be in terms of the British Army, and what are the crown jewels that you would wish to protect and invest?
Well, I still think, as I say, that mass is important, and you've got to put it in the context, but I do think the ability to deploy an armoured division with the fighting power that's sustainable over time is the key issue. Now, as I said earlier, the size and shape of that, with the technology and the changes we've got in capabilities, does not mean that needs to be 30, 40, 50,000 strong. It may be a 20,000 strong division, but with the necessary capabilities. So the ability to do, the lethality of what it delivers, scale of what it can deliver in terms of those deep fires, as well as the close battle, and the logistics and the support to sustain it on those operations. For me, that's the key issue. I wouldn't die, in terms of the current structures. I do think that the UK, the home base is important, and we need to have the capabilities of delivering that. But we've always argued that we should have an army that is capable of fighting at high intensity, and then it's very easily to move down from that to deal with lower intensity and with some of the things we've talked about. You can't have an army that only delivers humanitarian support or supporting home issues and so forth, and then think you're going to ramp it up to be able to fight high intensity quickly. You're not. So we have got to have that. That's got to be the heartbeat of what we deliver on. I think in the context of the broader issue, some of the things we've talked about, and particularly the Indo-Pacific, we're not going to. I don't think we'll be deploying an army to fight in the Indo-Pacific. So the maritime capability, the balance between maritime and air and land and space and cyber and so forth, will mean that the army is not going to. I don't think the army will come out of this defence review, numerically stronger with a lot more investment. I think it's relatively going to come out of it, which a lot of people would be upset about. But in the context of the broader intellectual conversation, I happen to believe that's probably right. But we still need to retain that core capability. I mean, I was listening on the radio coming in this morning, and one of our politicians sort of glibly said, we're still a major military power. I mean, our politicians are kidding themselves on what's going on at the moment. And unless they are prepared to put in 2.5%, 3%, I would argue 3%, then we are not going to be able to put the investment in that enables us to have those capabilities, to be a global power, whatever that means in the context of Indo-Pacific, and to be able to be a serious player within NATO. We should deliver, I think, probably niche capabilities into the land campaign for NATO, not be talking about putting divisions and corps to fight a land battle. And these are tough choices. That's why I've always, in the conversations that we both have with the media, I'm always very reluctant to be critical of individual politicians or even governments as a whole, because these are very tough choices. But that's why you have to start where you start, with this overall picture. What do we need? What capabilities do we leave? What are the different ways of delivering that capability? Air, land, sea, whatever. And then as you focus in on the air world, the land world, the maritime world, what are the capabilities you need within that environment? And we are not going to see the army doubling in size. I doubt we'll see an increase in the size of the army. But if we're going to be left with an army of 70,000, it has got to be capable. It has got to be able to fight at high intensity, and it's got to be sustainable and deployable. And that's what I think, I would like to see come out of this review.
Yeah, no, I think thanks so much for your time. I mean, this is something we're going to return to. I have absolutely no doubt. I've no doubt there's difficult choices for our politicians. But if it's true that the number one priority of any government is the protection of its people, then these conversations are absolutely vital. Because otherwise it's the answer's 2.5%. What's the question?
Yes.
Tim, thank you so much for your time and for giving up some of your day to join us today. An absolute privilege. Thank you.